The hum of the engines was a steady lullaby, the kind that promised peace and tranquility. The luxurious cabin of the private jet hummed with soft voices, the clinking of glasses, and the rustling of magazines. Above, the first-class seats were a sanctuary of comfort, each passenger nestled in their own bubble of wealth and exclusivity, far from the worries of the world below. Among them, Jason Carrington, a distinguished black executive in his late 40s, sat by the window, his eyes occasionally flicking out at the endless blue sky. His tailored suit, pressed to perfection, reflected his status as one of the top minds in the corporate world. For years, he had navigated the delicate corridors of power, his every move calculated, his success undeniable. Yet here, miles above the earth, he was simply another passenger, another privileged individual in the grand dance of the rich. The flight was meant to be a brief escape, a retreat from the high stakes of the boardroom. As he settled into the comfort of his seat, sipping a glass of champagne, the world seemed perfect. The kind of perfection only the affluent could experience. The subtle murmur of conversation around him was punctuated by the occasional soft laughter of a well-dressed woman nearby, her pearls glistening as she chatted with her companion. Everything about the flight felt seamless, luxurious, until it didn't. A subtle shift in the atmosphere alerted Jason to a change. It wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. The quiet tension in the air was like the calm before a storm. At first, he dismissed it. After all, this was first class. There was no reason to believe anything could go wrong. Then it happened. A man, sitting across from him, began to cough. It wasn't a normal cough. It was loud, deliberate, and invasive, the kind of cough that demanded attention, as though each rasping breath was meant to make a point. Jason looked up, momentarily meeting the man's gaze. The man was older, in his mid-60s, his face flushed, his eyes sharp but unwelcoming. Jason turned his attention back to his drink, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling gnawing at him. But then the muttering began. "Can you believe that?" the man grumbled to his companion, loud enough for Jason to hear. "First class. They just let anyone in here these days." The words hung in the air, thick and bitter. Jason's grip on his glass tightened ever so slightly. He forced a smile, the kind that had gotten him through many an uncomfortable encounter. "You're not going to let that bother you, are you?" the woman next to the man said, her voice sweet, but with an undercurrent of mockery. "It's bad enough that they let these people in, but now we have to deal with this." Jason's eyes narrowed. He felt the sting of the words before he even understood their full weight. His mind raced, calculating the situation, measuring his options. But as the seconds ticked by, the words from the man and the woman began to slither into his thoughts, spreading like poison. He forced himself to look away. There was no point in engaging, no point in stirring up trouble. Not yet. But the murmurs didn't stop. "Shame," the man continued, louder now. "I've been flying this route for decades, and I've never seen anything like it." The woman nodded in agreement, a smug look crossing her face as she glanced at Jason, as if she had just found the perfect target for her disdain. Jason could feel their eyes on him now, hot, accusing. The weight of their gaze pressed down on him like an invisible hand, heavy and suffocating. He took a slow, controlled breath. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, their words, or the fact that they assumed he didn't belong here, as though his presence in this seat was an insult to their so-called privilege. The calm atmosphere had shifted, replaced by something far more dangerous. The tension was no longer subtle. It was palpable. The man cleared his throat, making eye contact with Jason. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I don't think they're supposed to let your kind in first class, are they?" Jason froze, the words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. The woman beside him chuckled, her laugh laced with disdain. Every muscle in his body tightened, his heartbeat quickening. He had heard it all before, the subtle racism, the whispers, the disdain hidden behind polite smiles and half-hearted pleasantries. But something about the way this man had spoken, his blatant disregard for Jason's presence, struck a nerve. Jason's eyes flicked toward the flight attendants, who had been watching from a distance, but no one moved. No one stepped in. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. And in that moment, Jason understood. This was no longer just an uncomfortable situation. This was a challenge to his dignity, to his very right to exist in this space. A slow, calculating smile tugged at the corners of his lips. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The tension in the air was now thick enough to cut through with a knife. Jason's heartbeat had quickened, but he held his composure. He had learned long ago to mask his emotions, to bury the anger that would otherwise spill over in situations like this. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, a fire was beginning to burn, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished easily. The man across from him hadn't let up. His insults, veiled as casual remarks, kept coming. Each word dripped with disdain, each sentence a dagger disguised as pleasantries. He cleared his throat, ensuring his voice carried just enough for Jason to hear. "You know," the man said, casting a pointed glance at Jason as if trying to gauge his reaction. "It's good to see that they're being more inclusive these days. I guess it's a new trend, huh? First class for everyone." His lips curled into a smug smile, one that reeked of arrogance and superiority. "I'm sure it's a nice change of pace." Jason gritted his teeth, but said nothing. He could feel the weight of the man's words, each one designed to undermine his presence, to make him feel like an outsider in this exclusive space. The man's voice was so casual, so polished, that it made Jason feel like the target of a cruel joke, a joke no one else seemed to notice. Jason glanced toward the flight attendant, who was serving a passenger further down the aisle. She was making eye contact with him, but only for a second, before quickly diverting her gaze. It was as if she knew the situation, but was unwilling to act, unwilling to confront the subtle but insidious form of racism that was festering right before her eyes. She smiled politely at the man, almost as if she didn't hear the venom in his words. The man across from Jason continued, his voice growing louder, more confident. "I bet it must be an achievement, right? Being able to afford first class. But then again, I suppose money can buy you anything these days." His eyes narrowed as he leaned in slightly, his words cutting through the air like a sharp blade. Even respect. Jason could feel the anger rising in his chest. This man, with his pretentious tone and carefully crafted mask of civility, thought he could degrade him, all while hiding behind a veneer of politeness. It was the worst kind of racism, the kind that was not overt, not brutal, but insidious, disguised as a friendly conversation. Jason's fingers tightened around the armrest, his knuckles whitening. He wanted to snap back, to let loose every ounce of frustration that had been building up in him for years. But he knew better. He had been through this dance before. He understood how dangerous it was to react too quickly, to let them see how much they had gotten to him. They thrived on it. But the man was pushing him closer to a breaking point. "Some people just don't know their place," the man added, almost as an afterthought. He said it so casually, as if the idea of class distinctions was natural, as if Jason wasn't even there, just a prop in his small-minded view of the world. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He could feel his face flush with a mixture of shame and rage. How dare this man talk down to him like this? How dare he try to diminish his worth with every syllable? As if sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control, the flight attendant finally approached, but her demeanor was nothing more than a rehearsed mask of concern. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone sugary sweet, too sweet. She glanced briefly at Jason, then back to the man, a subtle but telling look of unease in her eyes. Jason met her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "No, everything is not all right," he said, his words carrying a weight that she couldn't ignore. "This gentleman has been making inappropriate comments to me, repeatedly." The flight attendant's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but then, like clockwork, she plastered it back on. "Oh, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, Mr. Mallory, would you please be more considerate?" she said to the man, as if scolding a child. But there was no real force behind her words, no authority. She wasn't reprimanding him. She was deflecting. Her gaze was now fixed firmly on Jason, as though he was the problem. "Please, let's all just try to enjoy the flight." Jason's heart raced. He had expected this, the dismissive tone, the refusal to acknowledge the depth of the situation. But still, the sting of it hit harder than he anticipated. He wasn't being heard. Not by her, not by anyone. She wasn't here to protect him. She was here to maintain the facade, to smooth over the cracks in a system that worked perfectly for people like Mr. Mallory, for people like her. The man, sensing his moment of victory, smiled and leaned back in his seat, his posture smug. He didn't even acknowledge Jason's presence anymore, as if the brief exchange had confirmed everything he believed about the world. Jason was nothing. He was a disruption in a space where he didn't belong. The flight attendant, after a final glance at Jason, walked away, her heels clicking loudly against the floor, a sharp reminder that she had no intention of confronting the situation any further. She was just a cog in the wheel, doing her part to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. Jason's mind raced. He had been humiliated, belittled in front of everyone, all while the system continued to turn a blind eye. The people around him, the other passengers, were either oblivious or too afraid to get involved. They were complicit in their silence, letting the man get away with it. They didn't want to see the ugliness that was happening right in front of them. But Jason wasn't going to sit idly by anymore. The facade of civility had shattered. What had started as subtle cruelty was now an open wound, an insult that couldn't be ignored. He wasn't just going to let this man walk away thinking he had won. He wasn't going to let the flight attendant pretend like everything was okay. Not anymore. Jason took a slow, deliberate breath, and for the first time, he made a decision. It wasn't about just getting through this moment. It was about something more, something deeper. And he would make sure everyone on this flight, everyone in this cabin, understood that. This was no longer just about a seat in first class. This was about dignity, about respect, about power. And it was time to take it back. The flight had now shifted into a tense and suffocating silence. But Jason could feel the storm building inside him, a storm that was no longer willing to be contained. His mind was razor sharp, processing every word, every slight, every inch of the humiliation he had endured. The man across from him, Mr. Mallory, had already made it clear what he thought of Jason's presence in first class. But Jason knew something now that Mr. Mallory didn't. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about respect. It was about power. And most importantly, it was about taking back what was rightfully his. His thoughts were interrupted when a soft but firm voice interrupted his reverie. "Excuse me, Mr. Carrington," the flight attendant said, standing in the aisle with her tablet in hand. Her voice was all politeness, a sharp contrast to the situation that was unfolding. She wasn't looking directly at him, instead choosing to direct her attention at the tablet, making a point to avoid eye contact. Jason's eyes narrowed as he lifted his gaze to meet hers. "Yes?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, one that she couldn't miss. She gave a small, practiced smile and leaned in slightly, as if her words were something meant to be whispered for privacy, even though the entire cabin could hear her. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," she said, her tone as sweet as sugar, but it carried an unmistakable layer of coldness. "You are in the wrong seat. This is a first-class seat, and unfortunately our policy requires that passengers with certain profiles be reassigned to economy class." Jason froze for a moment, disbelief washing over him. Wrong seat. He was a seasoned traveller, a man accustomed to the finer things, and no one had ever dared question his right to be where he was. He looked around the cabin, eyes locking with the other passengers. None of them dared speak, but they were all watching now, like silent witnesses to an execution. The discomfort was palpable, but it was as if they were all waiting for him to make the next move, waiting for him to confirm whether he was willing to accept the injustice. Jason took a deep breath, his fists slowly unclenching, but his anger was palpable. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. He looked at the flight attendant, his eyes steady, his voice colder than before. "You're telling me that I don't belong here?" He motioned toward his seat, the plush first-class space that he had paid for, the space that was his by every measure. The flight attendant's smile didn't waver, but her posture became more rigid. She lowered her voice slightly, as if to make sure no one else heard her next words. "I'm afraid it's company policy, Mr. Carrington. You can't remain here. It's an issue of seating regulations. I will need to move you to economy class immediately." Jason's face hardened. Company policy. He had heard those words so many times, often used as an excuse for mistreatment. But this was different. This was more than just policy. This was racism, pure and simple, wrapped up in a veneer of politeness. "I'm sorry, but I don't think you understand," Jason said, his voice quiet but heavy with contempt. "You don't have the authority to move me." His eyes burned with a cold fury, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "I paid for this seat, and I belong here." The flight attendant's gaze shifted nervously, but she stood her ground. "I'm afraid that's not how it works, Mr. Carrington. We will have to ask you to move. I'll have a member of the crew assist you with your luggage, and we can make the necessary arrangements." Jason's mind was racing, but his body remained still. He wasn't going to give in. This wasn't about a seat on an airplane. This was about something far larger, something that could no longer be ignored. He stood up slowly, taking in a long, deep breath. As he rose to his full height, the cabin seemed to hold its breath along with him. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, a moment of clarity. This was no longer about the injustice of a seat. This was about him asserting his right to exist as an equal in a space that had been denied to him for far too long. The flight attendant took a step back, clearly uncomfortable now that the situation had escalated. The cabin was filled with the sound of rustling papers, the whispers of passengers who were too afraid to speak out loud. Jason's voice was a low rumble as he addressed the flight attendant again. "If you think for one second that you're going to take my seat from me because of your policy, then you are gravely mistaken," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "If anyone needs to be moved, it's the one who's been disrespecting me, and that, Ms. Jones, is your so-called policy." The flight attendant hesitated for a long moment. Her fingers tightened around her tablet, and Jason could see the beads of sweat forming on her forehead as she tried to maintain control of the situation. It was clear that she had no idea what to do, and for a fleeting moment, Jason could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to someone standing up against this kind of injustice. After what seemed like an eternity, the flight attendant spoke again, her voice shaking slightly. "Mr. Carrington, please, this is not something we can discuss right now. I will have to call my supervisor." She backed away, still attempting to cling to her professionalism, though her body language betrayed her. The tension in the air was almost unbearable now, and everyone could feel it. As she turned to leave, Jason's gaze lingered on her for a moment. He could see the way the other passengers shifted in their seats, the way some of them looked down at their laps in a mixture of guilt and fear. But Jason knew one thing for certain. He would not be moved, not by her, and not by anyone else. The roar of the engines seemed deafening now, like a metaphor for the internal storm he was feeling. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had made his stand, and there was no turning back. "Call whoever you need to," he said, his voice low but clear, "because I'm not leaving this seat." And as the flight attendant walked away, Jason knew that the battle had only just begun. The humiliation, the racism, it would all be exposed, and this time, he wouldn't let it go unnoticed. Let's take a brief pause here. I'd love to hear where you're listening to our stories from. Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the next chapters. Now, let's continue with the story. The cabin felt suffocating now, the air heavy with the unspoken tension. Jason stood tall, his body rigid, but his mind was a storm of thoughts, each one running faster than the last. The humiliation was like an anchor weighing him down, but beneath the surface, something else was building. Something far more dangerous than anger. It was a cold, calculated resolve. He knew he couldn't let this pass, but he also knew he had to be smart about it. As the flight attendant retreated, she didn't dare glance back at him. She knew she'd pushed him too far, but she was also certain that the situation would resolve itself in the end. The other passengers, many of them still pretending not to see what was happening, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, hoping to avoid becoming part of the spectacle unfolding before them. Jason glanced around the cabin once more, but this time he saw them differently. The women in their expensive suits, the men with their arrogant expressions, the silent figures that filled this exclusive space, they were all complicit in this. Every one of them had been part of this system for so long that it had become second nature to them. Jason was no longer just a passenger. He was a target, and every pair of eyes on him was part of the bigger picture. The words of the flight attendant echoed in his head. Policy, regulation. He could feel the venom in those words, the subtle slap in the face. They didn't see him as a man. They saw him as a problem to be dealt with, a disruption to their comfortable little world. He was more than that, though. He was Jason Carrington, a man who had worked tirelessly to earn every bit of his success. He wasn't just here by chance. He had every right to sit in that seat, and he would make them understand that. Jason took a deep breath, and as he slowly lowered himself back into the plush first-class seat, he felt every muscle in his body tense. His eyes, however, remained cold, unwavering. He was a storm contained within the calmest of facades. He knew that showing his frustration would only give them the satisfaction they were craving. So he sat, still and silent, but with every part of him screaming that this wasn't over. His gaze swept over the cabin again, this time lingering on the faces of the other passengers. Some of them looked away quickly, unable to meet his eyes. Others, like Monsieur Mallory, were watching with a cruel sort of amusement, as if they were waiting for him to crack, to react. They wanted him to show weakness. But Jason wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. There was an unsettling stillness in the air now, a kind of silence that stretched on, almost unbearable. Jason's mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He could feel the eyes of the flight crew on him, watching, waiting. But he remained calm. He wasn't going to make a scene. Not yet. The last thing he needed was to play into their hands. He wasn't some angry black man lashing out in the face of disrespect. He was a man of control, of intellect, of power. And that was something they didn't expect. They wanted him to be like every other person they had put in their place. But Jason was different. As the flight attendant returned with a supervisor, Jason's eyes flicked toward the door of the cockpit. A plan was forming in his mind, cold and calculated. The supervisor was a middle-aged man, carrying himself with the same self-satisfied air as everyone else in first class. He walked up to Jason with a forced smile, his posture stiff and formal. "Mr. Carrington, I understand there has been some confusion," the supervisor began, his voice smooth and calm. He clearly had rehearsed this, but Jason wasn't buying it. He didn't care about his rehearsed lines or his apologies. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, and it was part of something much bigger. "I'm afraid you'll need to come with me," the supervisor continued. "We have to relocate you to your proper seat." Jason's eyes narrowed. His voice was steady as he looked the supervisor squarely in the eye. "I don't think you understand, sir. I'm not going anywhere." The supervisor's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Mr. Carrington, I must insist. This is company policy. It's not personal." Jason's laugh was soft, but it carried an icy edge. "Oh, I know it's not personal. This is about power. This is about making sure I know my place, and I'm not going to let you, or anyone else, tell me where my place is." The supervisor stepped back, clearly taken aback by Jason's confidence. He wasn't used to dealing with people who stood their ground, especially not in first class. Jason's gaze didn't waver, his posture as firm as ever. But it wasn't just about this moment. Jason knew he had to make a stand, not just for himself, but for the many others who had suffered quietly in spaces like this, where the system worked against them, where they were made to feel less than. He wasn't about to let this pass without a fight. "I'm not moving, and I'll make sure everyone knows why," Jason said, his voice cold but powerful. "I will make sure that this is exposed for what it is." The supervisor, realizing he was losing control of the situation, took a deep breath and turned to leave, likely to call for more backup. Jason didn't care. He had made his stand and he would not back down. He had waited his whole life to be in this position. He wasn't going to let anyone strip that from him. And as the supervisor walked away, Jason knew this battle was far from over. The humiliation, the racism, and the subtle violence of being treated as less than human were all things he would take head on. They thought he was broken, but they were wrong. Jason was just getting started. The cabin was quiet now, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that made you feel the weight of every unspoken word, every lingering glance. Jason sat back in his seat, his body relaxed, but his mind a storm of thoughts. The fight on the plane was over, for now. But the battle was far from finished. He could feel the stares of the passengers still lingering on him, like an invisible spotlight trained on his every move. Some were too afraid to meet his gaze. Others looked away hastily, as though trying to pretend none of this was happening. But Jason knew better. He could feel the suffocating atmosphere, the sense of discomfort that gripped the cabin like a vice. He didn't react. He didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break, of seeing him lash out. Instead, he reached for his phone, coolly sliding it from his pocket and staring at the screen for a moment. The silence was overwhelming, the low hum of the engine the only sound in the background. But Jason knew that what he was about to do would shatter that silence in a way no one on this plane would expect. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, considering his options. He could have made a call to his lawyer, to the press, to anyone who would help him get his message across. But Jason had a different plan in mind. His finger tapped the screen and the phone dialed out. The flight attendant, having seen him reach for the phone, approached cautiously, a forced smile plastered on her face. "Mr. Carrington, please," she said, her voice soft, but with an underlying tone of desperation. "I'm sure we can work this out. There's no need for any trouble. Just put the phone down and we'll resolve this, all right?" Jason didn't respond immediately. He just let the phone ring, the sharp sound cutting through the air with precision. He could see her standing there, shifting uncomfortably, her eyes darting between him and the other passengers. The smile never quite reached her eyes, and Jason knew she was trying to regain control of the situation. "You don't have to do this," she added, her voice tinged with frustration now. "We can handle it quietly, without making a scene." Jason's gaze never wavered as he listened to the ringing on the other end of the line. Each ring was like a reminder to the flight crew that they had pushed him too far. He wasn't just a man they could silence. He wasn't just a black passenger in their exclusive section. He was a force that would not be ignored. The ringing stopped, and Jason waited for the connection to be made. When the voice on the other end finally answered, his expression didn't change. "Yes, this is Jason Carrington," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "I need to speak to the CEO of the airline. Now!" The flight attendant's eyes widened, her hand instinctively reaching out as though to stop him, but she hesitated, unsure whether or not to intervene. Jason's words hung in the air, cold and firm. There was no backing down now. "Mr. Carrington, please," she began, but Jason raised his hand, cutting her off without a second thought. "You don't get to speak to me like that anymore," he said, his tone flat but full of authority. "You don't get to dictate where I sit or how I am treated just because you think you have the power to do so. Now you're going to listen to me." The flight attendant looked around, visibly rattled. She didn't know how to respond. She was still holding the phone in her hand, but her fingers seemed to lose their grip on it, trembling ever so slightly. The rest of the passengers were watching now, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, but none of them spoke up. The atmosphere had become thick with tension. Jason took a moment to compose himself, then turned his attention back to the phone call. He had the attention of someone important now, someone who would listen to his side of the story. But this wasn't just about making a call. It was about making them understand that what they had done to him, what they had tried to do, was unacceptable. Do you know what it feels like to be treated like you don't belong somewhere? Jason continued, his voice now louder but still controlled. To be treated like a second-class citizen, as though you don't deserve the same respect as anyone else? He paused, letting his words settle in. I've worked my entire life to get to this point, and you think you can strip that away from me just like that? Because of a seat on a plane? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the tension in the cabin growing unbearable as Jason's words sank in. He could feel the weight of it, the raw emotion that had been building inside him. He wasn't just speaking to the person on the other end of the line. He was speaking to every single person on that plane who had silently allowed this to happen. The flight attendant shifted nervously, her eyes darting back and forth. Jason didn't look at her. He didn't care about her discomfort. This was no longer about the flight. This was about something far bigger. This was about breaking the silence, about forcing them to acknowledge the ugly reality that existed in their world, a world where people like him were seen as less than. Jason exhaled slowly, his voice now firm and unwavering. I want answers, and I won't stop until I get them. Another pause, this one longer than the last. But finally, the voice on the other end spoke again. We'll have someone speak with you shortly, Mr. Carrington, the voice said, flat and emotionless. Jason didn't respond right away. He let the silence hang in the air, a victory in itself. As he hung up the phone, the tension in the cabin remained. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, still unsure of what to do, before finally walking away. She didn't say another word to him. Jason leaned back in his seat, his eyes scanning the room. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence, for now, was the calm before the storm, and he was ready for it. The tension in the cabin hadn't subsided. If anything, it had only grown thicker. Jason sat still, the hum of the plane masking the chaos that was quietly brewing beneath the surface. He wasn't just a passenger in first class anymore. He wasn't even just a man trying to hold his ground. He had become something else, a symbol. The other passengers continued to glance at him, though they made sure not to make direct eye contact. Their discomfort was palpable. Some whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances his way, unsure of what to make of the scene. They'd seen the flight attendants rush off, the supervisor's failed attempt to move him, but none of them knew the full story. None of them understood the gravity of the situation, nor the identity of the man they had been so quick to judge and dismiss. For them, Jason Carrington was simply a black man in a seat they thought he didn't belong in. They didn't know that he was far more than just a man trying to get to his destination. They didn't know who he was, what he had achieved, and why this particular fight was about far more than a seat on an airplane. As the plane cruised through the air, Jason remained silent, calm, but steely. His fingers brushed over the smooth surface of his phone once more, his thoughts moving quickly, as always, to the next phase of his plan. He didn't need to react to the comments, the whispers, the occasional sneers of the people around him. They weren't important anymore. He had bigger things to deal with. A strange vibration from his phone interrupted his thoughts. He unlocked it quickly, seeing a string of new messages. Most were from his company's private network, but a few came from people he didn't recognize. His lips curled into a thin smile as he scanned one of the messages. It was from one of his top executives. The message simply read, "Are you okay, sir? We've heard about the incident. The media is starting to pick up on it." Jason's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind racing. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was an opportunity. He'd known that things like this were bound to happen. The subtle racism, the dismissive attitude, the assumption that he didn't belong. He'd faced it before, but never like this. Never with such audacity. He had worked his entire career to prove that he belonged, to prove his worth in a world that often looked the other way. The incident on the plane wasn't just about a misplaced seat. It was about the constant reminders of his race, his position, his supposed place in the world. It was about every time he'd been told, directly or indirectly, that someone like him didn't belong in places meant for the elite. But this time, Jason wasn't going to just endure it. This time, he would fight back. And the fight would be bigger than any boardroom battle. It would be public. It would be undeniable. He tapped the screen, quickly sending a response to his assistant, laying out his plan. Prepare a statement. We'll be making an official announcement soon. I want every news outlet to know about this. We'll need all the support we can get. As he hit send, the tension in the air felt even more palpable. The flight attendants had come and gone, their eyes now avoiding his. The supervisor had taken his leave, but Jason could feel the weight of the entire cabin on him, as if they were all waiting to see what he would do next. And then, as the plane continued to hum through the sky, the phone in Jason's hand buzzed once more. Another message, but this time it was from an unknown number. He hesitated for only a moment before he opened it. Just wanted to check if you're still planning to make a scene. First class isn't the place for someone like you. The words stung, but Jason's smile only grew colder. They still don't get it. What they didn't know was that Jason wasn't some angry, reactionary businessman about to lash out in an emotional fit. He was a man who had spent years honing his sense of control, his understanding of power. He wasn't just reacting to the incident on the plane, he was using it to make a statement, to shine a light on the very issues that had plagued him for years. Issues that had been brushed aside by people like the ones surrounding him now. He stood up slowly, stretching his arms, making sure his movements were deliberate. The flight attendants tried to avoid his gaze, pretending as if they weren't part of what had transpired. But Jason didn't care anymore. He wasn't just a passenger. They had made him a symbol of something much larger, something that couldn't be ignored. As he walked towards the back of the plane to use the restroom, he could hear the murmurs of the other passengers. Some of them were trying to act casual, looking out the window, pretending not to notice. But Jason knew they were talking about him. "Did you hear that he's some big-shot businessman?" He overheard one woman whisper to another. "I don't know why he's so upset. It's just a seat, right?" Jason smiled to himself, his steps growing more purposeful. They still didn't get it. They thought it was about a seat. They thought it was about a small incident on a plane. But it wasn't. It was about a system that had systematically told people like him that they didn't belong. And now, Jason was about to tear that system apart. When he returned to his seat, Jason pulled out his phone again, his fingers moving with precision. He drafted an email to his legal team, instructing them to prepare for a lawsuit. The company would be sued for discrimination. Openly, publicly, without hesitation. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now, not ever. He hit send. And then, as if on cue, the plane's cabin lights dimmed and an announcement came over the intercom. It wasn't from the flight crew, but from the captain. Jason's heart skipped a beat as the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been informed of a serious issue regarding one of our passengers. We are doing everything we can to address the situation. Please remain seated and stay calm." The irony wasn't lost on Jason. The pilot was addressing the cabin as if the issue was about him, about his behavior. It was classic. It was exactly what he'd expected. But Jason wasn't worried. He was already moving ahead. His eyes flicked to the phone in his hand as he typed a quick message to his team. "Get ready for the storm. The world will know what happened today. They won't ignore us anymore." He sat back, feeling a sense of peace wash over him as the plane flew through the air, heading toward the unknown. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The hum of the airplane engines, once a comforting constant, now seemed to fill the cabin with an unnerving vibration. Jason's fingers tapped rhythmically on the armrest, the tension in the air palpable. It had been several minutes since his call, several minutes since the cabin had descended into a heavy silence. But that silence was beginning to crack. He could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer just discomfort. It was something much darker, something that would ripple through every single passenger on this flight. The first signs of chaos were subtle. At first, it was only a slight shuffle of feet. A few murmurs from the passengers who were still trying to act like nothing had happened, their forced casualness barely hiding their growing anxiety. But then the flight attendants began moving quickly, their faces pale, their steps more hurried than before. Jason could see it. He could feel the ripple of unease spreading through the crew. This wasn't just about an argument anymore. This was something else entirely. The moment he saw the two security guards appear at the rear of the cabin, it became undeniable. The tension reached a boiling point. Jason remained in his seat, still and calm, watching the scene unfold in front of him. The guards made their way down the aisle, their broad shoulders and uniforms unmistakable. Their presence alone was enough to make everyone in the cabin aware that something was very wrong, but it was the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty of their next move, that intrigued Jason the most. They weren't here because of a normal passenger issue. They were here because of him. The murmurs grew louder. Jason could hear a voice behind him. "Did you hear? He's not just some businessman. He's a real big shot." The words were whispered, but their meaning cut through the tension like a knife. Jason didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The moment the guards reached the aisle in front of him, one of them spoke in a low, firm voice. "Mr. Carrington, we need to ask you to come with us," one of the security officers said, his tone polite but strained. There was no more pretending. The realization was setting in. They had been dealing with a far bigger issue than they had anticipated. Jason looked up slowly, his eyes meeting the guards, with an expression that was both cold and calculating. He wasn't scared. In fact, he was almost enjoying the unfolding spectacle. "Are you really asking me to leave this seat?" Jason's voice was quiet, but it carried across the cabin with the weight of authority. "Is this how it's going to go? You and the rest of them trying to move me again?" The guard hesitated for just a moment, taken aback by Jason's unwavering calm. The moment passed quickly, but not before Jason saw the crack in their armor. They weren't expecting this. They were expecting compliance. They were expecting submission, and Jason wasn't giving them that. Around them, the passengers were now fully aware. The whispers had grown louder, more panicked. They could see that this wasn't just about a seat or a disagreement anymore. This was about power. And suddenly, they were all witnesses to a confrontation they hadn't been prepared for. One of the other passengers, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, spoke up, his voice shaky but cutting through the tension. "This is ridiculous. You can't let him." He stopped, his words faltering as he caught the look in Jason's eyes. It wasn't anger or defiance anymore. It was something far worse: control. Jason's control over the situation was undeniable, and the passengers were starting to see it. They had expected him to break under the pressure, to crumble when faced with the power of the airline, of the guards, of their collective judgment. But they were wrong. "Don't speak for me," Jason said, his voice low but sharp. "You have no idea what's going on here." He turned his attention back to the guards. "You think I don't belong here because of who I am, right? Because of the color of my skin?" Jason's words hung in the air, each one settling like a heavy weight. "It's not just the seat. It's the way I'm being treated, the way you see me, the way they all see me." The passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing nervously at each other. Jason had stopped pretending to be just a passenger. He wasn't playing along with their little show of civility anymore. They were all complicit in this, the silent, judgmental looks, the sneers, the low whispers. Another passenger, a younger woman sitting across the aisle, finally spoke up, her voice hesitant but shaking with discomfort. "I just don't understand. I mean, isn't he just overreacting? I don't see why it's such a big deal." She trailed off, as Jason turned his gaze toward her. The coldness in his eyes made her fall silent immediately. Her words had been out of line, and she knew it the moment she said them. Jason didn't even bother to respond to her. Instead, he looked back at the guards, who were standing now, unsure of what to do. The power had shifted in that cabin. Jason was no longer the man in the seat being moved around by the system. He was the one in control, and they could feel it. The tension in the cabin was unbearable, like a taut string about to snap. Some of the passengers were watching him now, not with judgment, but with a strange sense of awe. They had been watching a show they hadn't known they were part of, and they were starting to realize they had been complicit in something much darker than they had imagined. One of the flight attendants came over, her face pale, her steps hurried. "Mr. Carrington, please," she said softly, her voice almost pleading. "We don't want any more trouble. Let's just resolve this calmly, okay?" Jason looked up at her, and for a moment, his face softened. He was tired. Tired of the struggle, tired of fighting for recognition, for dignity. But as he stared at her, he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. "No more trouble," Jason repeated, almost amused. "You've already caused enough trouble." The guard finally took a step back, looking at his partner. The moment was over. They had lost control. Jason took one last look at the passengers around him. He wasn't just a man fighting for his seat anymore. He had become a symbol, and they were all watching as the consequences of their actions unfolded before their eyes. The guards left, retreating back into the galley. The flight attendant stood there for a moment longer, staring at Jason, before slowly walking away. Jason sat back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the chaos swirl around him. The flight would continue, but everything had changed. He hadn't just won a battle. He had started a revolution, and no one could ignore it. Not anymore. The plane had landed, and the immediate aftermath was thick with tension. The flight attendants, who had been so composed just hours earlier, now moved about with forced smiles, their eyes downcast. Their actions were mechanical, devoid of the charm they had once carried, as though the weight of the incident was now too much to bear. The guards, once confident, had quickly retreated, no longer in control of the situation they had tried to contain. And Jason, he was still seated, but he was no longer the man under attack. He had become the storm that everyone else was trying to outrun. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Jason felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He knew what was coming next. The company's leaders would have no choice but to act. They had no idea they were about to face the kind of backlash they'd never seen before. They thought they could simply dismiss him, silence him with a show of power. But he wasn't going to let them off the hook. Not now, not ever. The moment the plane came to a halt and the passengers began to disembark, Jason's phone buzzed. It was his assistant again. The message was brief, but it spoke volumes. "Press conference requested. They're already scrambling." Jason smiled. He hadn't expected them to act so quickly, but it was a sign that they were finally realizing the gravity of the situation. What they had thought was an isolated incident on a flight was now a full-blown PR disaster, and they were desperate to save face. The damage was done, though, and no amount of PR could undo what had already been set into motion. Within minutes of the flight landing, Jason was contacted by one of the airline's senior executives. The man's voice was cautious, almost apologetic. "Mr. Carrington, I want to personally apologize for the incident today. We're taking this very seriously, and we'll be addressing it immediately. The company is committed to resolving this, and we want to ensure that this doesn't tarnish your experience with us." Jason's lips curled into a thin smile as he listened. He knew exactly what they were trying to do: damage control. But it was too little, too late. The public was already catching wind of what had transpired, and the story was spreading like wildfire. "You think a few words are going to fix this?" Jason's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "It's not just about what happened to me today. It's about what you've allowed to happen over and over again. This is systemic. It's in your culture, your policies, and in every person who's ever silently let things like this slide. You've humiliated me in front of everyone, and now you're going to clean up your mess." The executive stammered. "We're not trying to minimize the incident, Mr. Carrington. We want to make it right. We promise." "Make it right," Jason interrupted, his voice lowering with authority. "You've already made it clear that someone like me doesn't belong in the same space as your elite passengers. But I'm not the only one who's been treated this way. You've been getting away with this for years. People of color, women, anyone who doesn't fit into your narrow vision of what's acceptable. You think I'm the exception? No, I'm just the one who's had enough. The executive fell silent, the weight of Jason's words sinking in. Jason knew the company's leadership had never truly confronted the systemic issues that lay at the heart of their operation. They had tolerated discrimination, both subtle and overt, for years. But now, it wasn't just about one incident. It was about everything that had been allowed to fester under the surface. It was about all the times people like him had been told, either directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong. Meanwhile, the media frenzy was intensifying. News outlets were picking up the story, and it wasn't just a small blip on the radar. The headlines were spreading like wildfire. Racial discrimination on flight. Businessman confronts. Airline over humiliation. Read one. Passenger evicted from first class due to race. A growing problem in aviation. Another screamed. The hashtag #Jancha Boycott Airline X began trending within hours, and Jason's name was becoming synonymous with the fight against the institutional racism that still thrived in places like first class. As the day progressed, the airline was forced into a corner. They issued a public apology, but it was too late. Jason's words had already hit home with the public. The apology came across as hollow, empty, a PR move meant to salvage their reputation, rather than a genuine effort to address the systemic problems that had been exposed. But Jason wasn't done. His team had already started preparing a lawsuit. The airline was going to pay for what they had done, not just to him, but to every person they had ever humiliated or discriminated against. And as he sat in his office, watching the story unfold in the news, Jason knew that this wasn't just about him. This was about something far bigger. It was about taking a stand, not just for himself, but for all the people who had been pushed down, silenced, and told they didn't belong. The consequences for the airline were only just beginning. The next day, a follow-up story hit the media. Airline under investigation for racial discrimination following incident with businessman. The pressure was mounting. Employees began to speak out. A few high-profile passengers who had been on the same flight had already made public statements in support of Jason. The public outcry was growing stronger with every passing hour. The board of directors, scrambling to save what was left of the airline's reputation, called an emergency meeting. They began drafting policies to address racial sensitivity, but Jason knew that no amount of policy changes could fix the damage that had been done. The airline had played with fire, and now they were being burned by their own ignorance and arrogance. Jason sat back, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. The battle was far from over, but he had already won the first round. The airline would never be the same, and neither would he. He had exposed them. And now he was going to make sure the world saw what they truly were. The buzz of activity in the corporate offices of the airline was frantic, a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and urgent meetings. The company's leadership was scrambling, each executive desperately trying to minimize the damage caused by the incident on the flight. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary case of poor customer service. It was a deep, systemic issue that reached far beyond a single flight or a single passenger. Jason's name was on the lips of everyone in the building, but the conversations were divided. Some people expressed disbelief, others frustration, but it was clear that many were fearful of the repercussions, of what would be uncovered, and how they, personally, might be involved. At the heart of it all, in the executive offices, the storm was brewing. A meeting had been called in the early morning hours, and the top brass of the airline had gathered in a conference room, tense and on edge. The CEO, a man in his early 50s with an air of superiority, was at the head of the table. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning his team, his face a mask of frustration. "This is a disaster," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to control this immediately. We can't let this escalate any further. The media is out of control, and the lawsuits are already piling up." One of the senior managers, a woman named Diane, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had been with the airline for nearly 2 decades and had seen plenty of crises, but nothing like this. She knew, however, that this wasn't just about one bad encounter. It was about something much bigger. The question was, how big? "Diane," the CEO said sharply, "what do you have for me? Have we found any information on the passenger's background? I need to know who we're dealing with here." Diane hesitated. She had been one of the people who had brushed off Jason as just another difficult passenger. But now, everything had changed. She cleared her throat before speaking. "We've done some digging, and it seems that Jason Carrington is not just any businessman. He's the owner of a large tech company, a very successful one. His background checks out. He's a billionaire," Diane said, her voice low, her discomfort palpable. "But there's more. He has significant influence in the business and political world, and his network is vast." The room fell silent. A billionaire? Jason Carrington wasn't just a passenger. He was a powerful figure, and they had just humiliated him. "What does that mean for us?" another executive asked, his voice tinged with panic. "Are we about to face a public relations nightmare?" Diane nodded slowly. "Yes, but it's not just about the PR, it's about what we did. We've had incidents before, minor things we've been able to sweep under the rug, but this time, this is different. We're dealing with someone who won't let it go. And worse, we've got a systemic problem on our hands. We're seeing the same racial biases over and over in how we treat passengers." The CEO's face reddened. He could feel the pressure mounting. The airline's reputation was hanging by a thread, and he could already sense the implications of this incident reaching far beyond the media's gaze. "We can't let this get out of hand. We have to find a way to spin this. We'll throw some money at it, settle the lawsuit, issue a few public apologies, and move on," the CEO said, trying to mask the growing panic in his voice. But his words fell flat. Diane and the others in the room exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the truth. This wasn't something that could be hidden. The systemic issues within the company ran too deep. And now, with Jason's influence, it was all going to come to light. As the meeting continued, whispers of Jason's past dealings began to surface. Some of the senior employees, those who had been in the company the longest, were starting to panic. Their own roles in the company's discriminatory policies were being called into question. "Is it true that some of our staff have been involved in discriminatory behavior in the past?" one executive finally asked, his voice quivering. "How much of this do we really have to answer for?" Diane glanced nervously at the others around the table. "There have been complaints in the past, yes, but we've always brushed them off. They were never serious enough to be addressed, or so we thought. But now, with Jason's background, this isn't just another complaint." The walls in the room seemed to close in on them as the gravity of the situation sank in. It wasn't just one passenger's complaint. It was an exposé on a deeply ingrained culture of discrimination. And the worst part? Some of the senior executives had been involved in perpetuating it. They were complicit in the very system they had used to elevate themselves while keeping others, particularly people of color, at bay. The CEO slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "We can't go down for this," he growled. "We'll make it go away. We have to act fast." But it was too late. Even as they spoke, the damage was already done. Jason had gone public. His name was on every news outlet, and his lawsuit was in motion. It wasn't just about this flight anymore. It was about the culture within the company, and the airline was being held accountable for every single injustice it had turned a blind eye to over the years. One of the senior managers, a man named Paul, leaned forward. "We need to control this narrative. We need to get ahead of the story before it destroys us." But another voice broke through, this one trembling with the weight of guilt. "We can't control it anymore," said Margaret, one of the older executives who had worked in HR for years. "Jason isn't the only one who has been hurt by this. We've been doing this for decades. Discriminating against customers, staff. It's a part of the culture, and it's finally catching up with us." A cold silence fell over the room. They all knew the truth now, but it was too late for apologies. The corporate world was about to feel the full force of Jason's revelation, and nothing they could do would undo the damage. In the coming days, internal investigations began. The airline's reputation, already fragile, was now in freefall. Executives scrambled to cover their tracks, but their efforts were futile. Evidence of the airline's long-standing discriminatory practices was leaking out. The policies that had been quietly ignored for years were now being exposed to the light of day, and Jason Carrington had become the catalyst for it all. As the pressure mounted, the company began to buckle under the weight of its own actions. They couldn't hide the truth anymore. The corporate world had underestimated Jason, and now they were paying the price. The storm in the boardroom was just the beginning. Jason had ignited a fire, and now the corporate world would burn. The airline would never recover from the impact. The scandal had reached every corner of the corporate world, and Jason Carrington had left an indelible mark. The humiliation he endured on that flight, the subtle but cruel racism they had subjected him to, was no longer just a personal grievance. It had become a symbol of the fight against systemic racism, and his revenge was as calculated as it was inevitable. The downfall of those responsible was swift and brutal. Jason, with his vast resources and connections, wove a web of influence that was impossible to stop. He knew it wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It wasn't about getting a public apology. Jason wanted something much bigger. He wanted to destroy the careers of those who had humiliated him and expose, once again, the institutional racism that had operated in silence for years. He used his influence with surgical precision. He reached out to the most powerful media outlets and leaked irrefutable evidence of the airline's systemic discrimination. Internal reports that showed how senior executives had directly benefited from policies that excluded and mistreated people like him were published. The evidence was clear, and there was no way to hide it. The story spread like wildfire, and the media wasted no time in exposing every dark detail about the company, from the abuse of power to the lack of policies to address racism. But Jason didn't stop there. With his network of allies, he managed to get government regulators to start a full investigation into the airline. A formal investigation was launched into discriminatory practices and corruption within the company. The senior executives who had thought they could continue to play with people's fates without consequence now found themselves at the center of a storm they couldn't control. One by one, they were called to testify. Sanctions were imposed, and in many cases, their careers were brought to an end. The CEO, the man who had run the company with arrogance for years, was the first to fall. The board of directors, pressured by investors and the growing public outcry, fired him from his position. But the damage didn't stop there. Diane, the manager who had minimized the issue, was dragged into the tide of disgrace. She was publicly dismissed, and over time, her name became synonymous with one of the biggest scandals in aviation history. Not only did she lose her job, but her career was effectively destroyed as she was excluded from the corporate world. As the culprits fell one by one, the passengers who had stayed silent, those who had looked the other way when Jason was humiliated, began to realize the full magnitude of what had happened. Many of them, deep down, had hoped it would all be resolved quickly, that Jason would settle for a simple apology, that things would go back to normal. But now, watching the powerful fall, watching the price they paid for their arrogance and racism, the reality hit them hard. Justice hadn't just been served, it had overflowed. One of the final moments in the public collapse of the airline came during a press conference, where the newly appointed CEO, chosen hastily to fill the void, attempted to apologize. His face was a mask of desperation as he tried to rebuild the company's image, but the journalist wouldn't let up. The questions were relentless. The data presented by Jason had destroyed any hope of restoring the company's reputation. The apologies sounded hollow, empty, a PR move meant to avoid the inevitable. Total collapse. And while all of this was unfolding, Jason watched from his office, observing how everything was coming apart, like a house of cards that could no longer stand. His heart wasn't filled with blind vengeance, but with a sense of justice finally served. What had happened that day on the plane hadn't just happened to him. It had happened to every person who had ever been seen as less than human, to every passenger who had been ignored or rejected simply because of their race, gender, or social class. Jason wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone. In his office, surrounded by his team of lawyers and communications experts, Jason didn't smile. He didn't need to. He knew what he was doing was far bigger than his own humiliation. It was a fight for dignity, for justice that was so often denied to the most vulnerable. He couldn't allow the culture of indifference and abuse to continue. And as he watched the careers of those who had looked down on him crumble, he realized that sometimes the only way to create real change is to destroy what must be destroyed so that something better can be built in its place. The remaining passengers who were still on the flight, those who had witnessed everything, left with the sense that they had been part of something much bigger, something that would change the way the world viewed discrimination in all its forms. Meanwhile, those who had thought they could walk away without consequences found themselves staring at the abyss of professional ruin. And in their eyes, reflected by the press and the reports, there was only one question. How much can pride and racism cost? The answer was clear. Everything.